Here's an experiment for you. Take passionate experts in human resource technology. Invite cross-industry experts from inside and outside HR. Mix in what's happening in people analytics today. Give them the technology to connect. Hit record. Pour their discussions into a beaker. Mix thoroughly. And voila, you get the HR Data Labs podcast, where we explore the impact of data and analytics to your business. We may get passionate and even irreverent, but count on each episode challenging and enhancing your understanding of the way people data can be used to solve real-world problems. Now, here's your host, David Turetsky.
Hello and welcome to the HR Data Labs podcast. I'm your host, David Turetsky. Like always, we try and find interesting people and interesting places to talk to you about the world of HR data, analytics, and technology. Today, we're talking to our friend, Garry Straker from Salary.com. Hey, Garry.
Good morning, David. Glad to be here.
And we're here at the WorldatWork conference, the 22 WorldatWork conference. And so Garry and I were just having an interesting conversation about pay equity and the data that underlies pay equity. So Garry, one of the pitfalls that we were talking about is actually starting with a good set of data and some of the pitfalls in where we're going to source that data. So from your perspective, what are some of the biggest issues that you find in being able to get good data that underlies pay equity analyses?
Leading a growing business, it's like building a plane while flying it. Team building, decision-making, and scaling all at once. At CPO Playbook, we get it. That's why our podcast, ranked in the top 10% worldwide, tackles the toughest leadership challenges with insights to help you lead smarter and grow faster. Tune into the CPO Playbook podcast because leadership doesn't come with a manual, but we're pretty close.
Yeah, I think that that's really a fundamental challenge for all organizations. And so one of the things that we see is that the data is typically incomplete. And so there are key data components that you would love to have in a perfect world. So for instance, educational qualifications of your employees, prior experience of your employees. And most organizations, virtually all, don't have that information when they're in their human capital systems. And so I think as we look at pay equity, there's so much time and energy being focused on doing that analysis. The analysis that we're doing today is based on the data we have today.
Right.
But we need to get better. We need to improve, I think, the quality and completeness of the data we use for pay equity analyses. And I think that's going to take time.
So we were talking, one of the sources we could possibly get that data from is the recruiting systems. But as we know, recruiting systems get their data from either applications or they get them from resumes. They may even get them from LinkedIn. To you, what are the pitfalls of being able to leverage those kind of sources to be able to get at that kind of data you're talking about?
Accuracy is always going to be a challenge, particularly if you're, sourcing it from places like LinkedIn. And even resumes, right? I mean, resumes don't always reflect, I'm not going to say the truth, but, sometimes there's data elements missing in the resume.
Let's call it unaudited.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you only put in the resume what you think is going to be important for a particular opportunity.
Right.
And so it may miss critical pieces of information.
So is there a good practice or is there a best practice when it comes to being able to get access to that data?
I think it's evolving, and I think organizations are going to have to develop processes and systems to be able to compile a more complete data set. It's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take time, but I think there needs to be a concerted effort and a commitment on behalf of organizations. If they're going to continue to do pay equity analyses credibly, they're going to have to make a commitment to obtaining that data over time.
So if someone's thinking about doing a pay equity analysis, is there something they should be preparing for in order to be able to get that data ready?
Well, I mean, the obvious starting point is looking at the data you have and the completeness of the data you have. And often we see gaps in the data that organizations have in their systems. And it may be because, they haven't fully leveraged technology over time, and maybe they're starting to, utilize it more, optimize it more. And so when what they're seeing is that there are holes, and they, to the extent that you can go back and fill those holes, I think that's a good starting point.
But that shouldn't prevent them from moving forward and doing the pay equity analysis, right?
No, I mean, you have to start somewhere. And so, not doing it on the basis of, we don't have all the data that we'd like to have, is probably not a good approach. You have to start somewhere, and I think there's incremental steps that organizations will have to take in order to get to that point where they have a more complete data set and feel confident about the analyses they're doing.
And I love the term incremental because you can't, we always hear the term Rome wasn't built in a day, and being able to make progress on the pay equity analysis and being able to move forward is a good start, right? So if you worry about all the things that might go wrong from the data perspective and not having enough, you're never going to get started because there is no such thing as perfect data set.
That's right. There isn't. And even the data you have can be looked at and interpreted in different ways. There was a very recent announcement about an organization we're all familiar with who, were investigated by the OFCCP. The OFCCP found that there were statistically significant pay disparities in the data that they were using. The organization, on the other hand, said the complete opposite. They said that they had done the analysis and they found no statistical significant pay disparities. And so, these models are run different ways. Perhaps the data is looked at differently.
Right.
And I think for organizations, they need to be prepared to sort of run multiple data sets, multiple models in terms of their multivariate regression analysis to, really look at it from all angles.
We've called this, and I've said this a lot, the Rubik's Cube, right? You have to keep twisting the analysis. You have to keep looking at it from a different perspective, right?
Yep. You need to wallow in the data. That's the term I use. And you have to, you got to leverage technology to be able to do that efficiently.
And sometimes that technology is Excel.
Good luck with that.
And Excel's not perfect, but it's a good start, right?
It is. It is a good start. But at some point it just becomes untenable, unmanageable because of, we all know that the analysis is only good as the data that's in there.
Right.
I think leveraging other technology solutions that can capture that data, maybe drawing it in from HCM systems, real time, preferably, or as close to real time as you can, would be very helpful.
Like what you hear so far? Make sure you never miss a show by clicking subscribe. This podcast is made possible by Salary.com. Now, back to the show.
So, Garry, one other thing that I wanted to talk to you about, which is that we heard, I think it was last week, that California is potentially going to put out a bill that would mandate that companies tell employees what they are doing with their data, meaning how they're storing it, where they're storing it, in what systems, what they're using it for, what analyses they're using it for. To me, this is kind of scary from the compensation perspective, but it also scares me from the people analytics perspective. What's your perspective on laws, on these types of privacy laws?
Yeah, I think it could be a real challenge for employers to, if these new laws are introduced, to adhere to them and still be able to conduct business in the way that they need to in order to make sure people are, for instance, being, paid appropriately, to make sure their benefit programs are being administered effectively and efficiently in order to control costs. Of course, that's a big part of any plan sponsor who has a health insurance plan in terms of their need. And so, I think it is a concern. We'll see where it goes, but certainly organizations are just under a lot more scrutiny. There's a lot more focus and attention, certainly around human capital risk and exposures. And this is probably not the end of it. I think we're going to continue to see these types of, legislative changes being put into place to protect information.
The thing that scares me about it is the potential for opt-out, where a current employee could potentially opt out of basically HR processes. I'm not really sure how we would deal with that, because then how would you be able to even pay them? I mean, thinking about things like, we talk a lot about pay equity analyses. We talk about just doing market pricing for jobs. How do we run our business without having that employee's record?
Yeah, I find it hard to imagine how an employer could allow an employee to opt out of certain aspects of their, information, whether or not it's demographic, pay, any other information that they keep on file without being disruptive to, business operations.
I think you were mentioning one example yesterday when we were talking about this offline, which was a self-insured company.
Yeah.
How can they manage their business? How can they manage their benefits if that happens?
Yeah, I mean, the vast majority of employees in this country get their health insurance through employer-sponsored self-funded plans.
Right.
And in self-funded plan sponsors, they spend an awful lot of time scrutinizing utilization data, and claims history and information. Obviously,
Right.
they need to do that to manage the risk and budget
Right.
appropriately. But controlling costs in the healthcare sector is a challenge that organizations are faced with. In order to do that, they have to have data, claims
Right.
data of their
Right.
employees and participants in the plan.
Now, while I can understand and appreciate the government or the state government wanting to protect an employee's rights, especially rights of privacy, got it, understand, especially in an era where we hear a lot of data is being stolen, and there are obviously legitimate reasons why you'd need to inform employees of those kinds of issues. But I'm just trying to think if a lot of times, a lot of companies, because they operate overseas, they're already trying to operate under GDPR.
Yeah.
So, is there an alternative to this for U.S. companies?
I think U.S. companies, and I think employers generally, are probably going to have to start helping employees understand how they're using their data. And so if employees have an expectation that their employer is going to, for instance, control healthcare costs in order to make it more affordable to their employees,
Right.
they're going to have to understand that we're going to have to look at data.
Right.
Same with the pay practices and policies. I mean, if an organization is committed to pay equity and employees are demanding it,
Right.
well, guess what? We're going to have to look at pay. We're going to have to
Right.
start scrutinizing demographic data and understand it. And so, but I think, employers are probably going to have to be maybe a little bit more proactive in terms of, hey, listen, we're going to use data about you in order to manage our business,
Right.
and manage our human capital risk. And I think employees who are not comfortable with that, well, they have a choice to make.
Absolutely. Well, we talked a little bit before about pay transparency. So in this case, I think what we're talking about is process transparency as well.
Yeah, and I think most employees, many of them probably don't really care. It doesn't mind. I mean, I happen to be one of those employees who doesn't think twice or worry about,
Right.
my information out on the internet or
Right.
whatever I do. My wife, on the other hand, is just completely paranoid about it, and she never puts any personal information on anything, any purchases or anything. So,
Right.
But I think, employees, I think, are going to have to, get sort of used to it. Some are going to have to decide whether or not that's a trade-off they're willing to live with in order to work for a particular organization.
Well, we've seen Apple get much tougher on how data is shared through their apps. We've seen Apple, even advertisements that have just aired recently, which talk about them clamping down on how organizations can collect data about their users, especially when it comes to email and other things. So in the consumer world, people are getting access to more secure ways of being able to deal with their data through, like, for example, their phone and their provider.
Yeah.
And so I think what they're, like they always do, they're going to come to expect from their employer kind of what they're expecting in the consumer side too.
Yeah, and I'm not quite sure it's going to ever reach that level on the employer
Right.
side. As I said, it could be disruptive to, business operations and practice, especially in the whole human capital area.
Absolutely. So Gary, thank you very much. That was insightful. And I'm sure we're going to be talking more about this.
Great. Thank you, David. Enjoyed that.
All right, cool. Take care. Thank you. And everybody, stay safe.
That was the HR Data Labs podcast. If you liked the episode, please subscribe. And if you know anyone that might like to hear it, please send it their way. Thank you for joining us this week, and stay tuned for our next episode. Stay safe.